When I first met Jessica Reed, she was the kind of woman who could walk into a crowded room and make every conversation pause without even realizing it. Not because she was loud or dramatic, but because she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided she deserved the best in life. We met through friends at a weekend barbecue. She worked in marketing, she said, and I remember her describing her office in a downtown glass building as if it were a movie set. I didn't tell her much about mine that night. I only said I worked in tech, which was true, just not the whole truth. At that point, my company was small but steady. Marcus Carter, my oldest friend, and I had built it from a cramped apartment 6 years earlier, coding through nights and taking odd contracts until we landed something real. The business had grown into a cybersecurity firm that handled private networks for government and medical clients. We had a modest team, and our names weren't yet on the local business pages. That suited me fine. Jessica liked the idea of ambition but didn't understand the slow grind behind it. She liked results. Her life had been comfortable, never wealthy, but curated, designer bags bought on credit, vacations posted for likes, dinners paid in halves but remembered as gifts. When we started dating, things were easy. She laughed easily back then, and she believed in us, or at least in what she thought we could be. The first cracks began subtly. It started when her friend Amanda got engaged to a man who worked in real estate. She mentioned it offhand while scrolling through photos. I was in the kitchen, brewing coffee, and I heard her say, "Amanda really got lucky, she doesn't have to think about bills anymore." I said nothing. Over the following months, small remarks like that began to collect like dust in corners. They weren't accusations, but they carried weight. Sometimes, she would talk about couples who went to expensive restaurants or spontaneous weekend trips to Napa. She'd mention how her coworker's boyfriend surprised her with jewelry, adding that she didn't even like jewelry that much, but it's nice to feel appreciated. I didn't take it personally at first. I thought it was just conversation. But something in her tone changed. She began to ask about my work more directly, what projects I was working on, how much longer until a promotion, whether I'd thought about switching companies to something bigger. I kept my answers vague. My name wasn't public yet, and I didn't see a reason to advertise ownership. I wanted to know her before she knew that part of me. I'd learned from watching people treat Marcus differently once our company started getting attention. The moment money entered a room, sincerity left. It was one Friday evening that her patience cracked. We were at a small Italian restaurant we both liked, the kind that played faint jazz in the background and served pasta in handmade dishes. She had ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most dinners, and when the waiter left, she leaned forward and said, almost jokingly, "Sometimes I think I deserve a man who earns more." She laughed afterward, as if trying to soften it, but her eyes didn't. I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe you do," I said quietly. That silence that followed was heavy enough to press against my chest. She looked confused, like she expected a counterargument, maybe some reassurance that I'd prove her wrong. But I didn't give her any. I finished my drink and paid the bill without another word about it. She didn't apologize. She texted me later that night, saying she didn't mean it the way it sounded, that she was just frustrated. I told her not to worry. In truth, I wasn't angry. I was simply watching the truth surface in front of me. The next week, I began noticing little changes. She started working later, claiming new clients and projects. Her tone on the phone was hurried, distracted. She said she was tired, that her boss was pressuring everyone to meet impossible deadlines. I believed her until I noticed the scent of cologne on her jacket that wasn't mine. It wasn't expensive, but distinct, something sharper, like oak and spice. I didn't confront her. I wasn't raised to chase explanations that people weren't ready to give. Instead, I began paying attention differently. I checked the Uber receipts that appeared on our shared ride account. Twice she'd taken rides downtown during times she told me she was at work. Once, she had a charge from a restaurant I'd never been to, the kind that served cocktails in crystal glasses. Still, I said nothing. Around that same time, Marcus and I were preparing to finalize a major deal that could shift everything for us. The Department of State was reviewing our proposal for a multi-year cybersecurity contract. It had taken months of revisions, background checks, and quiet patience. If we landed it, our company would grow from a regional player to a recognized name in government tech. Marcus, ever the optimist, said we'd already won. I wasn't so sure. I've never trusted good news until the ink dries. Jessica, meanwhile, began to talk differently. She used phrases like long-term stability and financial direction. She dropped hints about maybe returning to school for an MBA. I could see the logic forming in her mind, how she was testing the waters of upward mobility, and how I might not fit that equation. One Saturday morning, she asked if I'd ever considered applying to a larger company, maybe somewhere like Microsoft or Oracle. I told her I liked where I was. She smiled faintly, and said, "You could do better, Daniel. You're too smart to stay in one place." I asked, "What makes you think I'm staying in one place?" She hesitated, then changed the subject. That evening, after she left to meet her coworkers, I drove to the office. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own breathing. I walked through the glass lobby where our new logo had just been installed, and for a moment, I thought about how strange it was that she had never been here. Not once in the entire year we'd been together had she asked to see my workplace. Maybe she didn't care to. Or maybe she preferred to imagine it as something smaller than it was. The next morning, I received a message from Marcus with a copy of a background report he'd pulled on a man named Ethan Blake. Marcus handled most of our client-side security checks, and he had stumbled upon the name while running a check for a potential investor. Ethan was a financial advisor, mid-30s, clean record on paper but with several hidden lawsuits pending under his company's parent name. One of the addresses listed matched the same upscale bar receipt from Jessica's Uber ride. I didn't ask Marcus to investigate further. I didn't need to. Jessica's behavior over the following weeks confirmed what I already suspected. Her texts became shorter, plans canceled more often, explanations rehearsed. There was a time I would have demanded honesty, but instead, I felt strangely detached. I realized I was less angry than observant. At night, I'd lie awake thinking about how many relationships collapse not because of betrayal but because of revelation, when one person finally sees the other without the fog of illusion. 2 weeks later, she suggested we take a short break. She said she needed time to think about her future. I told her that was fine. She seemed almost surprised I didn't protest. Before she left that night, she looked around my apartment as if saying goodbye to something smaller than she wanted. I spent the next few days buried in work. The contract came through, conditional approval pending final documentation. It was everything we had been building toward for years. Marcus was ecstatic. I felt relief more than joy. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I passed by the building's main lobby where the new directory had been installed. My name, Daniel Miller, was etched beside the title Chief Executive Officer. The cleaning crew had just polished the glass. The letters gleamed faintly under the lights. I stood there for a moment, thinking about Jessica's words at that dinner table. I deserve a man who earns more. Maybe she did. Maybe she deserved someone exactly like Ethan Blake, someone who wore his ambition loudly enough for her to hear it. But I had learned something from the quiet. Sometimes the loudest success is the one that doesn't need to announce itself. As I locked up the office and stepped into the night, I realized I hadn't lost anything. Not really. I had just uncovered what was always there, hidden beneath charm and expectation, a person measuring love by price tags, unaware that she was standing beside the very thing she claimed she wanted. And somewhere inside me, a quiet, calculating part had already decided, I wasn't going to confront her. I was going to let reality do it for me. The first week after Jessica left, the apartment felt both larger and smaller. Her absence wasn't painful, only pronounced. The quiet was unfamiliar at first but soon became comfortable, like a noise I hadn't realized I'd been living with was suddenly gone. I filled my days with work. The contract with the Department of State was entering its final stages. Meetings, revisions, compliance reviews, it was a constant rhythm of controlled chaos. Marcus and I worked late into the evenings, often ordering food and talking about expansion plans. He asked about Jessica once, and when I said she needed space, he didn't press. He'd known me long enough to sense when something wasn't worth discussing. Still, curiosity is a stubborn habit. A few nights later, I found myself scrolling through social media, not to spy but to confirm what I already knew. Jessica's posts had changed. The captions that once said "we" now said "me." A wine glass here, a skyline there, always framed with the kind of effortless glamour that tries a little too hard to seem effortless. Then I saw him. A man tagged in the background of one of her stories, tall, wearing an expensive gray suit, laughing over dinner. His profile name read Ethan Blake. I didn't have to dig far to connect the dots. Same name, same city, same face that appeared in the security reports Marcus had shared weeks earlier. I could have ignored it. I should have. But curiosity turned into calculation. Through the quiet network of industry contacts, I learned more. Ethan ran a boutique financial consultancy that promised high returns through private equity placement. It sounded legitimate enough to fool clients, but a few former associates had whispered about improvised ledgers and misplaced investments. Nothing official, nothing public, just murmurs in the right circles. I didn't tell Marcus. I wanted to keep business separate from personal matters, but that separation began to dissolve when one of our potential investors called to withdraw. The reason? They were moving funds to a better opportunity under a firm called Blake Advisory Partners. That name stuck in my head for the rest of the day. By evening, I was sitting in front of my laptop, cross-referencing Blake's business filings with the state's corporate registry. The documents were clean, too clean. Several shell companies under identical addresses, but each listing different management. On paper, it was legal. In practice, it was a maze built to confuse. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, realizing how close our worlds were circling without touching. Jessica had left to chase status and landed in the orbit of a man who built his empire on misdirection. A week later, she called. It was unexpected. Her tone was cautious, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. She asked how I'd been, how work was going, whether I was still with that small firm. I answered each question simply. Yes, I was fine. Yes, work was steady. Yes, same firm. She laughed lightly, then said she hoped we could catch up sometime. I told her I was busy. It wasn't a lie. After that call, I noticed how quickly my irritation faded into something closer to fascination. I wasn't trying to win her back, I was watching a story unfold. The more I learned about Ethan, the clearer it became that he wasn't what he pretended to be. A few days later, I had lunch with Marcus at a quiet diner near the courthouse. Between coffee refills and paperwork, I asked him if he'd ever heard of Blake Advisory Partners. He frowned, thought for a moment, and then said, "That name came up on a security scan last quarter. Some irregular fund movement flagged by our monitoring tool." He looked at me. "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curiosity." He didn't buy it but didn't ask further. Later that night, I opened my inbox and found a forwarded message from one of our data auditors. A minor breach had been detected in a financial server we'd been contracted to secure. The client's name? Blake Advisory Partners. I stared at the subject line for several minutes before opening it. The incident report showed traces of unauthorized data transfers, likely someone inside the company manipulating ledgers. The timestamp aligned with the exact week Jessica had left me. That was when the detective part of my mind, the one honed from years of cybersecurity work, began to connect patterns. The leak wasn't random. It was intentional, designed to move funds invisibly, covered by fake client activity. I sent the data to Marcus under the pretense of a case study, asking him to verify the breach source. He agreed, curious, unaware of the personal undertone behind it. By the weekend, I had confirmation. Ethan's firm was laundering investor money through dummy accounts. The proof was clean, traceable, and damning. What struck me wasn't surprise. It was the symmetry. Jessica had left looking for wealth and landed with a man whose entire wealth was counterfeit. I could have gone to the authorities right then, but I hesitated. I wanted the truth to surface naturally. Exposure is far more devastating when it's self-inflicted. Days turned into weeks, and I let silence do its work. Jessica didn't call again, but I heard about her indirectly, through friends, through passing mentions. Apparently, Ethan had taken her to expensive events, dressed her in things she could only dream of before. For a moment, she was exactly where she wanted to be. But fortune built on lies has an expiration date. The first public crack appeared when a local news site published an article about questionable investment practices under investigation by the State Financial Bureau. The name Blake Advisory Partners appeared halfway down the page. No arrests yet, just suspicion. But I knew it was the beginning. The following morning, Marcus walked into my office holding a printout of the same article. "You won't believe this," he said, dropping it on my desk. "Remember that security case you sent me? The firm's under review. You might have stumbled into a full-scale investigation." I nodded slowly. Sometimes things expose themselves. He gave me a strange look but didn't ask. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, lights off, watching the rain smear the reflections of the city. I thought about Jessica, about the dinners, the subtle comments, the quiet judgments. I imagined her scrolling through the same article, the realization settling like cold air around her. I didn't feel vindicated, not exactly. Just steady. It occurred to me that silence was often the loudest answer. When people think they're walking away from failure, they don't realize they might just be walking toward it with better lighting. The story about Blake Advisory Partners kept spreading, first as rumor, then as headlines. What started as an internal audit became a full-scale investigation. Investors demanded withdrawals, regulators froze accounts, and Ethan Blake, the man with perfect suits and rehearsed confidence, began to disappear from his own meetings. I never called Jessica, and she never called me. But the city has a way of shrinking when news travels fast. I heard from Marcus that Blake's offices were less than a mile from ours. He joked that maybe I should invite them over for a security consultation. I laughed, but part of me wondered how long it would take before she walked back into my orbit. It didn't take long at all. It was a Thursday morning, quiet except for the hum of servers and the low voices of our staff preparing reports. We had just finalized the contract with the Department of State. Marcus and I were signing the final compliance forms when my assistant knocked, saying there was a visitor asking for me by name. No appointment. Just insisted she needed a minute. I didn't ask who it was. I already knew. When I stepped into the lobby, Jessica stood near the reception desk, clutching her bag with both hands. She looked different, thinner, tense, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Her eyes flicked around the office, taking in the clean glass walls, the modern furniture, the quiet efficiency of people moving with purpose. "Hi," she said, almost whispering. I nodded once. "Jessica. I didn't know you worked here," she said. I was nearby. Nearby was an understatement. Blake's building was 3 blocks away. I gestured toward the hallway. "You want to talk?" She followed me through the corridor. Her heels echoed faintly on the polished floor. When we reached the end, I opened the door to my office. Her eyes went to the name etched on the frosted glass, Daniel Miller, Chief Executive Officer. For a second, she didn't move. Her breath caught. Then she turned to look at me, eyes wide in disbelief, mouth slightly open but no sound coming out. I walked past her, sat down behind my desk, and waited. "You're the CEO?" she finally managed. "I am." She blinked rapidly, trying to connect the image she'd built of me with the one in front of her. "You never said?" "I never needed to." She walked slowly toward the window, staring out at the skyline, her reflection trembling against the glass. "I thought you worked here. I didn't know it was your company." I said nothing. Silence worked better than explanation. After a moment, she sat across from me. "I read about Ethan," she said quietly. "Everything that's happening, it's not true, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "You'd know better than I would." She looked down at her hands. "He told me it was a misunderstanding. But then his accounts got frozen, and his phone stopped working. Reporters were waiting outside his building. She stopped. I didn't know what to do." Her voice cracked, not dramatically, but like someone realizing the scaffolding of their life had been built on paper. I opened a drawer, took out a stack of signed documents, and began reviewing them. I didn't want to humiliate her, that wasn't the point. I just wanted her to see the contrast, how the man she left for success was being investigated for fraud, while the man she dismissed was signing government contracts. She hesitated, then asked, "Can we talk?" "I made mistakes, Daniel." "People do," I said without looking up. "I was wrong about you." I finally met her gaze. "No, you were right. You just didn't stay long enough to see it." Her expression crumbled. The confidence, the sharp edges, the vanity, all of it dissolved in seconds. I leaned back in my chair, remembering that night at the restaurant, her saying she deserved a man who earned more. Back then, those words had stung. Now, they felt distant, almost academic. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "Nothing," I replied. "You already said everything that mattered." For a moment, we just sat in silence. Outside the glass wall, 2 of my employees passed by with folders in hand, glancing briefly at us before continuing. The normal rhythm of work continued while this quiet reckoning played out inside the room. She started to speak again but stopped when my phone buzzed. I checked the screen. Marcus was calling. I excused myself, answered, and listened as he told me the contract had been fully approved and funds were cleared for transfer. The deal was official. Years of work had just solidified in a sentence. When I hung up, Jessica was still sitting there, her hands clasped together. "Big news?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes. Something we've been building toward for years." She smiled weakly. "I always knew you'd make it." "No," I said. "You knew I could. You just didn't think I would." She closed her eyes briefly, then whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond. There was nothing to forgive. Before she left, she asked if we could meet again sometime, just to talk. I told her maybe, which we both knew meant no. When the door closed behind her, I exhaled slowly, not in relief but in finality. The chapter had ended itself. A few days later, the news broke completely. Ethan Blake had been arrested for securities fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. The article showed his mugshot beside the same smile he'd worn in every photograph Jessica once liked online. Marcus brought the newspaper into my office, shaking his head. "The guy's going to prison for a long time." "You think your ex knew?" "She knows now," I said. He laughed softly. "Life has an interesting sense of symmetry." That evening, I walked home through the cool autumn air, the city buzzing quietly around me. I passed restaurants where couples sat laughing under dim lights, and for a moment, I wondered how many of them were measuring love by the same invisible yardstick Jessica once used. When I reached my apartment, I poured a drink and sat by the window, thinking about how calm I felt. No gloating, no anger. Just closure. I remembered her face when she saw my name on that glass door, how everything she believed about me fractured in an instant. It wasn't revenge, it was revelation. People always talk about karma as if it arrives like thunder. But sometimes it's just a quiet afternoon when someone walks into the wrong office and sees the truth spelled out in polished letters. That moment was enough. After Jessica left my office that day, I didn't expect to hear from her again. But silence has its own rhythm, people who can't live with it eventually fill it. A week later, I received an email from her. No subject line. The message was short. She said she was sorry for judging me, sorry for leaving the way she did, and hoped we could meet for closure. I read it twice and closed the window without replying. The following days were a blur of progress. The government contract transformed everything. We expanded our staff, leased 2 new floors, and brought on consultants who'd once ignored our calls. For the first time, our name appeared in business journals. My calendar filled with meetings I'd only imagined attending a year before. Yet I wasn't celebrating. Success felt like a tide slowly rising around me, steady, unstoppable, but strangely quiet. Marcus was the one who insisted we mark the moment. He booked a dinner with our core team, ordered champagne, and toasted to 6 years of surviving without losing our minds. During the dinner, my phone vibrated several times. I ignored it until later, when I saw Jessica's name on the screen. The messages came in fragments. Can we talk? I need to explain. Then, a few minutes later, you were right about everything. I set the phone down and let the conversation die on its own. 2 days later, the news about Ethan escalated. He was indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud, with millions unaccounted for. His firm collapsed overnight. Clients filed civil suits, and regulators froze his personal assets. Every article included a variation of the same line. Blake Advisory Partners built an empire of deceit. I didn't need to imagine what Jessica was going through. I knew her patterns too well. She'd be retreating from the same social circle that had once applauded her for dating him. The same friends who envied her posts would now avoid her calls. In her world, reputation was oxygen, and she was running out of air. Marcus called one afternoon to say he'd been contacted by an investigator from the Financial Crimes Division. They'd traced some of the data I'd flagged earlier and wanted to verify the digital trail. I gave them everything: emails, log files, timestamps. It wasn't personal vengeance, it was professional obligation. What I found ironic was that my quiet observation, the same detachment Jessica once called boring, had become part of the evidence that would convict the man she'd chosen over me. Weeks passed. Winter crept into the city. Work consumed most of my time, but the silence of my personal life began to feel less like absence and more like peace. I'd come to understand that peace isn't something you find, it's something that remains when noise finally stops. That's when I met Rachel Summers. She was a legal consultant hired to assist with our compliance filings for the new contract. Efficient, articulate, with a kind of calm humor that made long meetings bearable. She never asked about my personal life, never tried to fill silence with flattery. One evening, as we reviewed documentation late at the office, she mentioned how rare it was to meet someone who could focus for hours without looking at their phone. I laughed. Old habit. Watching too much teaches you too little. We started meeting outside of work, not planned dates, just casual coffees that turned into dinners. She asked questions that weren't about status or money. She cared about the structure of ideas, about why people build what they build. I found myself explaining things I hadn't shared with anyone in years, the mistakes, the early failures, the nights Marcus and I nearly gave up. She listened without trying to fix anything. It was a slow kind of connection, not the kind that explodes but the kind that endures. About a month later, I received a handwritten letter. The envelope had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Jessica. I unfolded it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of perfume, the same one she used to wear. The letter was long, several pages written in tight, slanted lines. She said she'd been wrong about everything, that she'd lost her job after the scandal, that her parents had to help her move out of her apartment. She said she realized too late that security and decency were worth more than appearances. Near the end, she wrote, I saw you on the news last week. They mentioned your company and called you one of the promising young entrepreneurs in cybersecurity. I'm proud of you, Daniel. I wish I had been patient enough to see who you really were. I folded the letter back and placed it in my desk drawer without answering. Some things deserve to remain unfinished. By spring, Ethan's trial began. The courtroom photographs made every paper. His expression was hollow, defiant but drained. I attended one session quietly at the back, not out of spite but curiosity. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutors described the laundering network almost exactly as I'd mapped it months earlier. He was sentenced to 12 years. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with early frost. Reporters shouted questions as people exited. Among the crowd, I saw Jessica at a distance, standing alone, coat wrapped tightly around her. She noticed me for a second, then looked away. That was the last time I saw her. Life afterward settled into something steady. Rachel and I became closer, and for the first time in years, I felt balance rather than performance. My company continued to grow, though success no longer felt like revenge, it felt like alignment. Sometimes, during quiet evenings at the office, I still think of that moment when Jessica saw my name on the door. The look on her face wasn't anger or envy, it was realization. She had misjudged not just me, but the entire idea of worth. And I had misjudged her too, by assuming that love could exist without understanding. Months later, I cleared out some old paperwork from my drawer and found her letter again. I read it once more, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity about how time rewrites memories. The words felt smaller now, like echoes from another life. I placed it back, not to hold on to it, but to keep a reminder of how quietly truth can surface when you stop trying to prove it. Marcus once told me that every downfall begins with a sentence someone never forgets. I think about that sometimes. Jessica's sentence had been simple: I deserve a man who earns more. It had sounded like arrogance back then. Now I see it as prophecy. She did find one, and it cost her everything. When people talk about success, they imagine celebration. But real success often looks like stillness, the absence of needing to be seen, the calm that follows after the noise. And every time I walk past the glass wall with my name etched on it, I think of that day she stood frozen in front of it. Her apology still makes me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was unnecessary. The world had already given her the answer.